Welcome to everyone to the installment of the Repair Lecture Series, which hosts scholars, activists, and practitioners to share their thoughts, their work, and their experiences with reparations movements and programs around the world. And the Repair Lectures are hosted at the Anthropology Department of the University of Amsterdam, and the project is funded by the European Research Council and also supported, the lectures are also supported by the University of Amsterdam's Center for Conflict Studies. So today's lecture will be about 40 minutes. Tina will talk to us about 40 minutes, and Tina, I'll give you notice when you've got 5 minutes and then 1 minute. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. And we do record the lecture portion of today's event. The Q&A will not be recorded, in case that's important for anyone to know. I'm Tabitha Herinek. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Amsterdam, and my work focuses on what repair and reparation mean for nuclear harmed communities in New Mexico, where I am also speaking to you from today. So through my research, I've gotten to know and have been incredibly inspired by today's speaker, who I now have the great honor of introducing. And that is Tina Cordova. She is a 7th generation New Mexican from the town of Tularosa and has been a tireless advocate for communities affected by nuclear harm across our state. Coming from a family impacted across multiple generations and as a cancer survivor herself, Tina brings an invaluable and highly personal perspective to understanding nuclear harm and reparation in New Mexico and to issues of environmental justice more broadly. In 2005, Tina co-founded the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium with the late Fred Tyler to bring attention to the negative health effects suffered by the unwitting and uncompensated victims of the first nuclear blast on Earth. That was the Manhattan Project's Trinity Test. Through her advocacy, which has taken her to testify before Congress and also lecture at universities across the United States, Tina has dedicated herself to fighting for the inclusion of the New Mexico Downwinders in the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which I'm sure she'll tell us about today. Tina's work has been recognized with numerous awards, including the Con Alma Foundation's Hero of Health Award and the Physicians for Social Responsibility's Health Hero Award, among many others. As an advocate and community leader, Tina brings in who's been on the front lines of the fight for nuclear justice in New Mexico. Tina brings an essential perspective to our lecture series. Her insights, which are very much rooted in lived experience and deep community engagement, promise to enrich our understanding of what reparation means in our world today, as well as what meaningful justice can look like. So with that, I turn it over to Tina. Please join me in welcoming this passionate advocate and community leader. Okay, over to you, Tina.
Thank you so much, Tabitha. That was a wonderful introduction. And I'm sorry, thank you, Tabitha. Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Tabitha. And thank you for working to bring this opportunity to me to be able to speak to the students that you work with in Amsterdam and other places. I always value these opportunities because so many people don't know this history. And I have really valued the time that you and I have spent together collaborating. I'm glad that you're back in New Mexico for the time that you're going to be here. I know that you will add so much to what we're doing, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to work with you. Good morning, everybody. Good evening. I know everybody's across a variety of time. Thank you for joining today. My goal is to speak to you about a variety of things and cover as much as I can in the next 40 minutes. I want to do an introduction basically to the idea of what took place in New Mexico, starting with a description of the Trinity Test, speaking to you about our lifestyles that meant we were maximally exposed to radiation, the effects not only on my family, but the thousands of families that we've documented, the infant mortality that took place in the months after the test. I want to talk to you about the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act and what that compensation looks like and what it means to the people of New Mexico, and the shortcomings, because there are many shortcomings to the compensation that we're currently receiving. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about a documentary that's been produced about our work and the people of New Mexico. The documentary is very good at not only describing what happened to the people, but describing the science of the test and how we were exposed to radiation. So I'm going to jump right in. I want to tell you first a little bit about New Mexico. New Mexico was, it entered statehood in the US in 1912. So we're not that old as far as being a state in the United States. We're the 5th largest by land mass, but we're one of the most unpopulated states in the country. We only have about 2 million people living in New Mexico. The other thing that's really unique about New Mexico is that we are the only minority majority state that has been a minority majority state since the inception. We have more people of color living here than not, and our state has, that's been the demographics in our state forever. Our state is unique in also being one of what I would call one of the most patriotic, because as it relates to World War II and other wars that followed, our state per capita had more people enlist in service, more people die in service, and we bought more war bonds. And so we have always done our share to contribute to the safety, the well-being of our country. We've stepped up to do that over and over. And as you'll learn today, we also have given everything we have, basically, in defense of our country as victims of the first atomic bomb. And so the test that took place in New Mexico in 1945 was basically the Manhattan Project culmination. They came here in 1942 to establish the Manhattan Project. They took land through eminent domain from Native American and Hispanic farmers in the northern part of New Mexico to establish Los Alamos Labs, and basically displaced the people off the land that they owned. To do that, paid them pennies for their property. And those people were never able to really recover from that. It was a devastating loss to them. I always say that when they came here to establish the Manhattan Project, they invaded our lands and our lives. They destroyed our environment, and then they left. And that holds true when it relates to the Trinity Test as well. In 1942, when they came here to build the Manhattan Project, to build the atomic bomb that they tested at Trinity, and to build the bombs that they used in Japan, they started doing what are called radioactive lanthanum tests in 1944. So people always think that the beginning of the exposure to radiation for people didn't start until 1945 with the detonation of Trinity. And the truth is that they were already doing radioactive tests in Los Alamos in 1944. In 1945, before the test at Trinity, they actually did a 100-ton test using conventional explosives laced with radiation to see what would happen with fallout, because they knew that the bomb would create fallout, and they wanted to sort of monitor in advance where that fallout might go. And they detonated a bomb, a 100-ton bomb, out near the Trinity site, and that bomb indeed produced fallout with radiation that they traced to all parts of New Mexico. So in advance of detonating Trinity, I always tell people there were things that they knew that were very well established, and there were things that they didn't know. The things that they knew were, number one, that radiation was dangerous to human health. That was a well-established fact in 1945. They also knew, because of the 100-ton test in May of 1945, that when they detonated the bomb at Trinity, that it was going to create fallout, and that they would likely spread fallout across the entire state of New Mexico. The things they didn't know, though, are, number one, exactly what would happen when you place a bomb of this magnitude on a platform 100 feet off the ground. They also didn't know how much plutonium would be necessary to cause the fission process. So the bomb was placed on a platform 100 feet off the ground. It was overpacked with weapons grade plutonium. They put an entire 13 pounds of plutonium in that bomb. Only 3 pounds were necessary for the fission process, which means an entire 10 pounds of plutonium went up in that fireball. When you detonate a bomb 100 feet off the ground, the force of the bomb comes down, intercepts the earth, takes up an enormous amount of plant, animal, dust, debris, incinerates it, and creates a fireball that continues to ascend. That fireball, they guesstimate, went at least 40,000 feet past the atmosphere into the stratosphere. Once that fireball reached the stratosphere, the fallout then was traced around the world. But the fallout that ascended as the fireball ascended was subject to the weather. And so that's how the state of New Mexico was irradiated. At different areas, it was stratified, and the fallout, depending on the winds, went in every direction. July happens to be what we call the monsoon season in New Mexico. That's our rainy season. That's when we get the major part of our moisture in one year. And on that date, July 16th of 1945, there were massive rainstorms after the bomb was detonated. They actually waited in between rainstorms to detonate the bomb. It was scheduled to go off in the middle of the night, and it was raining so hard. There was such a major rainstorm and lightning storm that they had to wait for that to break up so they could detonate the bomb. That's why the bomb was detonated at about 5:29 a.m. It was in between storms. The storms that came later that day would have then brought down the largest particles of radiation and deposited them all across New Mexico in hot spots, depending on where the rain fell, how much rain fell, and where the fallout was traveling at the time of the rainstorm. That's called a rainout. We also know that as that cloud traversed the United States all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, that it deposited radiation similarly where there were rainstorms. And I'll talk a little bit more about the cloud traversing the United States. So we now have radiation being deposited all over the place pretty randomly and in concentrations no one was ever able to gauge. We do know that the government had monitors in place in all the little towns surrounding Trinity, and we only know of the data from a town called Carrizozo, 35 miles away. And it's very well documented in the history that the Geiger counters went off the charts there in the hours after Trinity. And the government, well, the General Groves, who was in charge of the test, had been encouraged by the meteorologists and the physicians also assigned to the test to prepare to evacuate the town of Carrizozo. And I just want to point out that in all of those little towns, Carrizozo, Tularosa, where I was from, Socorro, San Antonio, we had active rail systems. We had a railroad that ran through all those towns. And instead of lining up rail cars to evacuate people, they lined up cattle trucks. And I always tell people that gives you some idea of the lack of concern for human beings in the aftermath of this major explosion, because cattle trucks are filthy. They're not properly ventilated. There's no place to sit down. And we don't move cattle in July in cattle trucks because it's inhumane. And so they never did evacuate anybody. Even when they met the threshold at which they had planned to evacuate people, they doubled it. When it reached that threshold, they doubled it again. And at some point they said to the monitors, you need to leave because it's not safe. But they did not warn the people before or afterwards, and they left. The reason that our lifestyles played such an important part in why we were overexposed is two major things. Number one, we did not have running water in all of those small towns that surround Trinity. We depended on the rain that fell from the sky. We collected it in cisterns, which were holding containment vessels, sometimes built into the ground, sometimes above the ground, but basically water was channeled off of pitched rooftops through a system of gutters and downspouts into these cisterns, and people collected that water. The other thing is we depended on our acequias, or irrigation ditch systems, open ditch systems. In the town I grew up in, we have the largest open ditch system in all of New Mexico. We depended on the rivers, the lakes, the streams, holding ponds that were built in all these small towns where they would truck water in regularly to fill the ponds. And so people depended on the rain that fell. And as the rain fell in those days immediately after Trinity, all of that water was now contaminated. Secondly, we didn't have electricity, not widespread, not into people's homes. So we did not have refrigeration. That meant there were no grocery stores. You couldn't go to a store and buy dairy, meat. You couldn't buy, produce. So all of those things were produced by your own means at your own home. And families spent a great deal of their time, number one, making sure that they had adequate water. Number two, making sure that they had adequate food. Everybody had a garden and an orchard. We lived very organic lifestyles. And now all of that was basically destroyed. And people didn't know. They didn't know that drinking fresh cow's milk was a danger to them. And honestly, even if they had told us, without much explanation, people would not have known or understood what exposure to radiation meant. There's a story in the history of Trinity where, scientists from the Manhattan Project visited a ranch near the Trinity site, and they were in a white, rudimentary Tyvek suit with a rudimentary Geiger counter. And the rancher approached them and said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "Checking for radiation." And he said, "You won't find any here because we don't own a radio." That's how little people knew about radiation and what that meant. Without electricity, there were no televisions, no means of communication other than a newspaper that was oftentimes only printed once a week and shared amongst people. No way to communicate with the outside world. So I also always tell people when they say, "Well, we didn't warn anybody before or afterwards because of security purposes," I always say that's kind of a, that's a misconception, because without communication with the outside world, there was no way that the people of New Mexico were going to communicate this top secret, this top secret test. They actually lied afterwards when the newspapers were printed in the days after Trinity. They said an ammunition dump exploded. No harm was done. They also have always characterized the area around Trinity as remote and uninhabited. No one lived here. No one was harmed. But through the work of a student at the University of New Mexico who took 1940 census data and a map of New Mexico and placed Trinity at the center of the map, and then drew diameters around Trinity in 10-mile increments, we know now that at 50 miles away from Trinity, in a radius 50 miles around Trinity, there were 13,000 children, women, and men living here. That's not remote and uninhabited. And if you extend that boundary to 150 miles, which after the test, they said, we can't do this here again because we overexpose people to radiation. And if we do it any place, we have to find an area with a 150-mile radius uninhabited. If you extend that radius to 150 miles, it encompasses two major cities, Albuquerque and Santa Fe to the north, and El Paso and Ciudad Juarez to the south. And you're talking about 500,000 people, not remote, not uninhabited. They just simply didn't see us, didn't want to see us. So what have been the effects? Well, in my own family, I'm the fourth generation to have cancer since 1945. I had two great-grandfathers alive at the time of the test in Tularosa, living right at the 50-mile radius from Trinity. They both died 10 years after the bomb from what they were told was stomach cancer. We'll never know because there was really no diagnostic process back then. They were given morphine and they were sent home to die, and they both died within a few months. Both my grandmothers had cancer. My dad died after having 3 different cancers. In my own immediate family, my mother is being followed for a tumor of the parotid gland. I have 3 siblings. My sister has had cancer. My youngest brother was just diagnosed this year with kidney cancer. His daughter has had thyroid cancer. I've lost track of the aunts and the uncles and the cousins who have either been afflicted with cancer or who have died from cancer. And my family is not unique. We've documented thousands of families just like mine, displaying 4 and 5 generations of cancer now. We know, obviously, what the physiological effects are. It's cancer, it's disease, it's autoimmune disease, it's, it's death, it's sickness, it's dying. But what we don't talk about very often are the social problems, the psychological problems and the financial problems. And just to sort of put an exclamation mark on what this has looked like for the people of New Mexico, we are the state that is most dependent on Medicaid, the government assistance that we receive for healthcare of any state in the whole country. And we are also one of the states carrying some of the highest medical debt. Last year, it was revealed that the 2 million people living in New Mexico are carrying $881 million in medical debt, almost $1 billion. And that is not a sustainable equation. If these effects aren't enough, that now we have 5 generations of people with cancer. In those months directly after Trinity, we had a spike in infant mortality. Babies died. What I say all the time now is that the first victims of an atomic bomb were American children right here in New Mexico, because we went from losing about 30 babies per 1,000 that summer to losing over 100 babies per 1,000. And the babies were dying the way that you would expect they would if they had been overexposed to radiation. Their gastrointestinal tracts were not working properly. So the things we have seen in the data, and we've collected all of it, for the counties where it's available, what we have seen are babies being listed as dying from summer diarrhea, marasmus, gastroenteritis, enteritis, those effects that would align with being overexposed to radiation. It's not just that their little bodies couldn't overcome the radiation load they were exposed to. Their mothers would have been breastfeeding them. That would have been likely the only option. And just like all other mammals, their mothers would have been concentrating the radiation in their mammary glands, poisoning their babies and not even knowing it. We had a lot of babies born with birth defects during that summer as well. And again, we have gathered that data and are documenting that and have further work to do. But the government has never returned to atone for this or admit that it was as a result of the bomb. We also know that there was not an outbreak of anything that would have caused this to happen. We've looked into that. There was no outbreak of cholera or some other gastrointestinal bug. And we had gone through a steady 10-year decline in infant mortality after the advent of antibiotics, number one, and number two, more hygienic practices being used by people here. So in 1990, 35 years ago, the US government set up a fund called the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. And that fund has been available to people who are downwind of the Nevada tests. After they tested in New Mexico, they tested in the Pacific Islands. And then eventually, after destroying those islands, they brought testing to the Nevada test site. That fund had been paying people who lived as far as 259 miles from the Nevada test site, but it never included the people of New Mexico. We were the first victims of exposure to radiation, and we were obviously left out of the fund. The fund has, at the time, at the end of last year, the fund had paid out $2.6 billion to claimants who lived in primarily 3 states, Arizona, Utah, and Nevada. But again, nobody from New Mexico had ever been included as downwinders. We also have uranium mining here. And so we have uranium miners that have been made sick by the process of extracting uranium from the earth. New Mexico at one time was called the Uranium Belt. We have, through Navajo Nation, Laguna and Acoma Pueblo, which are Native American lands spread across New Mexico, parts of Arizona, and southern Utah. We have over 1,000 abandoned uranium mine and mill sites where they extracted 32 million tons of uranium. So obviously we have a lot of uranium workers that have been affected. They're included in the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, but they were only included if they worked up to 1971. The reason the cutoff was set at 1971 is because in 1972, that's when we started mining uranium to be used in the process of generating nuclear power. And the government said, if industry is going to be using uranium, not just the government, then we think industry should share in the responsibility for making people sick. And industry never stepped up to help the uranium workers. So we have been working, we established the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium, or TBDC for short, 20 years ago to bring attention to the negative health effects suffered by the people of New Mexico as a result of being overexposed to radiation from the Trinity Test. We have collaborated with downwinders from all across the United States and the Pacific Islands, and we have worked very closely with uranium mining communities to fight for the expansion of RECA, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, because it never went far enough. It never addressed the entire scope of what happened when they were testing devices and when they were mining uranium. And about 5 years ago now, we worked with a scientist he was at Princeton. I understand now he's in Wisconsin teaching, but his name is Sebastian Philippe, and he just won a MacArthur Award, Genius Award, for the work he did. And what he did was he recreated the Trinity blast and the 93 above ground explosions that took place in Nevada, because only 93 actually detonated of the 100 that they tried. He recreated those blasts, and then he used today's technology and historical weather data to produce a fallout map, a deposition map of the fallout. And what we have learned from that, and his findings will be released hopefully before the end of the year, if not the beginning of next. What we have learned is that when they detonated the bomb at Trinity, they irradiated 46 states in total and parts of Canada and Mexico. So these tests had far-reaching consequences, much past the boundaries of where the tests occurred. We also learned that many states were irradiated by the testing that was done in Nevada, New Mexico being one of them. And if you compile all the tests that were done, what his findings, when they release them, will reveal is that Nevada was the most irradiated state, followed by New Mexico. So this year, finally, well, in 2024, RECA passed the US Senate with a vote of 69 to 30. That never happens these days in the US Senate. We never see a bipartisan vote like that. We were overwhelmed with the support that we got. That bill that passed paid reparations of $100,000 to victims, and also gave people who were in need and dealing with cancer at the moment healthcare coverage. They had to strip out the healthcare coverage to get the bill passed this year, and they had to reduce the number of states covered. So they still do not cover Colorado, Montana, or Guam, and they did not add the entire state of Nevada or Arizona. They only added the entire state of New Mexico, Utah, and Idaho. And so we're grateful, we're very grateful, but we know that there are shortcomings. Number one, the cutoff date for New Mexico extends from 1944, when they started doing the radioactive lanthanum, through 1962, when they did the last above ground test in Nevada. 1962 is an arbitrary cutoff in our minds, because it's as though testing a device is a static process. The bomb detonates, it disperses radiation, and that's the end of that. Those radioactive isotopes have very long half-lives. Plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years. So that 10 pounds of plutonium that was dispersed in the Trinity bomb, wherever it was dispersed to, which were all parts of New Mexico and other places, it'll be here for 24,000 years, to say nothing of things like strontium and cesium that have half-lives in the 30-plus year range. These radioactive isotopes are around for a very, very long time. So the qualification period needs to be extended. There are only 19 compensable cancers covered by RECA today. That's far too few cancers. As an example, they don't cover prostate cancer. They don't cover bone cancer. They don't cover certain cancers that we know today are linked to radiation exposure. The list is based on what we knew in 1990. We are going to fight for the inclusion of more cancers. And then lastly, well, not lastly, we're also going to fight for the inclusion of Colorado, all parts of Arizona, Nevada, all parts of Montana, and Guam. And then on top of that, you know, we want to fight for the healthcare coverage. The healthcare coverage is the most important part of this whole process. So those are the shortcomings. We still have obviously a fight ahead of us. We know that. We're up for that fight. We know that the passage of the $100,000 one-time payment is a great step forward. It's a door open to us. It's an acknowledgement we haven't been able to get for 80 years, and we're going to continue to build on that acknowledgement. The last thing I want to talk about is the documentary. So there's a documentary produced by Lois Lippman. It's called First We Bombed New Mexico. I'm certain Tabitha can share the link to the trailer with all of you. The documentary's winning awards at film festivals all across the country. It's very well done. It's not just a docudrama that actually tells the history of the people and what we've been through, the horrible sacrifice and suffering of the people here. It's not just that. They also weave in the science of what takes place when a nuclear test is detonated. And the science is very important for people to understand. The science builds basically builds the background for why these things are so detrimental and why they have such far-reaching effects and consequences. So right now, Lois is working to get the documentary on a streaming platform and made available to everybody across the world. And we have our fingers crossed that that will happen soon. They are hosting community screenings. There is a fee for that, a license fee, but more communities are raising the funds to have a community screening, and the film is being seen more widely across New Mexico and at universities across the country. And so we're grateful for that, because right now at a time when we're about ready to have the START treaty expire, and the thought of the US government saying that they're going to reinitiate nuclear testing, everybody needs to understand that there is no safe way to do this, and that they say it's safe and seemingly it is right up until the moment it's not. And then when it's not, it's catastrophic and you can't take it back. And we cannot open up the door for testing. We did over 1,000 tests, and I think there were over 2,000 tests worldwide, and we can't open the door to that any longer. Far too many people were affected by the testing that was done. And I always think to myself of the wonderful line from the speech that President Kennedy gave when he signed the test ban treaty in 1962, right after the missile, the Cuban Missile Crisis. He and Khrushchev came to terms with this because they both knew how close we came to an all-out nuclear war. And he said something to the effect of, if only one child in the United States died because he or she was overexposed to radiation, that's one child too many, because it's not natural. And we should all be working towards, a world free of these devastating consequences. You don't escape. You may not die. I always tell people, I don't know anybody that died the day of Trinity, but I know thousands of people that it was the beginning of the end for, and many of them were my family members. And so I think with that, I'll stop, and we can start the Q&A portion of the gathering today. I know it was a lot of information to cover in kind of a short period of time, but I'm willing to answer any questions. I don't really feel like anything is off limits.
Thank you, Tina. That was brilliant. I really appreciate you sharing your story, and I know how hard it is to talk about the pain and the impacts that you personally experience in your family. And so I just want to say thank you and give my gratitude to you for sharing that with us, because I know it's tough. To everybody who's here, thank you very much for joining.